Parizek.
Okay. It's recording now.
My name is Lorri Parizek. I'm Tom's grandmother on his mother's side of the family. I was born in 1936 here in Illinois. I grew up in a small town. I did not suffer the worst of the Depression because of the fact that it was pretty much getting over by the time that I was born. I was the middle child of 5, and I lived in Marseilles, which is a town now of about 4,500 people, and it was a town of 4,500 people when I lived there. So it hasn't gone anywhere. It's gone downhill. It's hard to know where to start. I remember more of the stories of the Depression from my parents than obviously the things that I experienced. What I can tell you was the outgrowth of what went on during the Depression. Goods and household goods, clothing, shoes, all that kind of thing were scarce. The war came shortly after the Depression ended. The Second World War started. And so when I was born in 36, so in about 1941 the war started, and there were shortages of everything during that time. Everything was recycled and everything was handed down. I had 2 older sisters, so I was third hand for getting everything that I got. And we wore shoes until our toes went out the end of them, and we resold and rehealed our shoes all the time. The shoemaker was one of our best friends because we were in and out of there so often. I didn't want for food, I can never say that, but our meals were much simpler than what they are today. And we had a great big house on the top of a cliff overlooking the whole town, and that house was the envy of many, many people. But my father had bought it the year after I was born for a whole $4,000, and it was a wonderful, wonderful place to grow up. My grandparents lived on farms, both sets of grandparents. My father's parents lived on a very poor farm, rocky, hilly kind of a place. Their crops were lean. They had animals. They had pigs and they had geese that bit my behind every time I went out there to the farm. They had 1 horse and they had cows, and they had enough land to support them, but very poorly. On the other hand, my Irish grandparents lived on the flatland south of Seneca, Illinois, and they were prosperous farmers, and they had a family of 8 children. My mother tells the stories of the Depression times and the hobos that came to get food and to try to find work as hired men, as they were called all the time. And my mother tells the stories of how every morning she and her sisters and her mother would get busy very early, about 7 o'clock in the morning, or even before. They would start making pies and making food for all the hired men for the day. And she had 4 brothers, and so her brothers worked on the farm right along with her. With the women inside, the men outside. And it was a very rigorous life with just an awful lot of work. They were never what you would call dirt poor. That was a term that was used in those days. But she did talk about the Depression as being very, very difficult, and that oftentimes it was real hard to believe that it could be over. My father developed a Depression mentality that lasted with him his whole life long, because he was never sure that he was going to have enough to take care of us, and there was always a sense that the bottom could drop out again. And he used to say that, well, you never know when the bottom will drop out again, and we'll be right back where we started from. But he was a prosperous man who, during the war, when no cars were available, he left his dealership, and he was the postmaster of our town. And I was terribly proud of him, because the post office was an imposing building, and we would go in to visit him, and the people that were the cashier, or whatever you call them, that you would see to buy your stamps and whatever, they'd signal to him. when any of us were there, and we would knock on this gigantic tall door that was solid oak, and then he'd say, "Come in," and we would go in, and he would always be sitting on his chair with his feet up on the desk and his hands behind his head, leaning back. And we said, "Daddy, don't you ever work?" But he did that every single time. It was kind of the joke, of the town, that whenever we went to visit him, he would pretend that he didn't ever have any work to do. So as soon as the war was over and automobiles began to be made again, Chevrolet came back to him and begged him to take his franchise back, because he was absolutely the best person to do that. He was a very bright businessman and became quite successful after the war. My father's mantra always was, "Under all is the land," because land could always support you. If you didn't have money, if you didn't have anything else, you could plant a little victory garden, like they used to call it during the war. Victory gardens were what they called vegetable gardens, and so anyway, you could always plant a victory garden and you'd have food. But also, farms were a wonderful investment because they didn't lose any value. They just generally, for the most part, always went up in value. So that was, he'd never buy buildings or any of that kind of thing. He bought land, and it served him quite well. My childhood was happy because we were free. There was never any reason to be fearful of anything, so we just ran the streets and lived on a high hill, and we sledded day in and day out until our woolen clothes were soaking wet, and it took a long, long time for them to dry out, and we didn't have two sets of them. But even our mittens were made of wool. And when they get wet, they get really wet, and it takes hours on a radiator or heat register for them to dry out. So that was a memory that I have of my childhood. I heard lots of stories from my older relatives about the deprivations that they had during the Depression, but that was not a part of my life. I think the attitudes and the mindsets of the older relatives that I had always were affected by their experiences during the Depression. It made a lasting memory in people's heads, and that whole generation that went through the Depression didn't forget anything about it. They may have prospered as years went by, but they didn't. The memories of the Depression and the fears of the Depression and that type of thing stayed with them, because it was life was uncertain. After the Depression was the war, and one war turned into another. The Korean War came along, and Vietnam War, and all that kind of thing. So it was great tumult. And I think oftentimes today we think that these are really bad, really scary times, but in reality, the times that we're going through right now, and I don't diminish the difficulty of today's day and age, but they had some much greater things to worry about, with many less opportunities and also creature comforts.
Is there anything you'd like to say about FDR or about the Depression in general?
Well, I do, because to my family, FDR was the great savior. My grandparents, both sets of grandparents, came very close to losing their farms because of the Depression, but the policies of FDR made a huge difference, and they were both able to maintain their farms, so that he was a hero to the people. At least I lived in an agrarian type of area. I mean, my town was 4,500 people, but farms were everywhere around, and everybody had family members that lived on farms and whatever. So FDR was a real hero. And then, of course, when we went into the Second World War, he was a very great leader during that time. There was something else I was going to say, but it's gone for the time being. You asked another part of that question, Tom.
Is there anything else you'd like to say about the Depression in general?
Well, one other thing I knew I was going to say about Roosevelt. My father got his appointment as the postmaster through President Roosevelt, and he always on the bedroom wall had a large framed portrait of Roosevelt, and underneath it was this real official statement of him being appointed postmaster of Marseilles. So that was one of the proud things in his life, and it was a treasure because it was signed by the president. And heaven knows whether this was a duplicated thing like signatures are today, or whether he had actually signed this. We can only speculate.
Thank you very much, Grandma.
You are welcome.
And I'm sorry that we had to do this again. Just for the record, we originally did another one. We had another gentleman here. He had to leave, but it did not record, and we did this for about an hour. So we've just condensed it into 10-something odd minutes. So.
So here we are.
Well, thank you very much.